So welcome everyone. This is our March 2021 IEF webinar. Today we are welcoming Dr. Stephen Friberg, who is a physicist. Dr. Friberg has worked in the fields of quantum optics, applied physics, and semiconductors through his long career. He's worked in Japan, where when he was living in Japan for 10 years, he helped to start a Association for Baha'i Studies branch in Japan. And he's been active with the Association for Baha'i Studies for many years, including helping to launch the Science and Religion Special Interest Group back in the 80s and 90s. Now I'm going to hand it over to Stephen.
I want to thank Kayla and the International Environment Forum for inviting me today. I was in Japan from 1990, from actually 1989 to about 1999. And we started an Association for Baha'i Studies there. In 1995 or thereabouts, we had an Association for Baha'i Studies and conference in the Tokyo Baha'i Center. We had a wonderful conference because we featured the Japanese tea ceremony with Baha'i prayers. The Universal House of Justice, which is the body heading the Baha'i faith around the world, praised the Japanese Association for Baha'i Studies for holding that Japanese tea conference with Baha'i prayers, saying that it showed the Japanese people that the Baha'i faith was compatible with Japanese culture. Now, I'm thinking back about that, I realized that that was kind of a kind of initial exercise in discourse. We were relating the Baha'i faith to Japanese culture. I think in the 25 years since then, discourse has evolved, or the Baha'i understanding of discourse has evolved considerably, to the point that now, in this time of the pandemic, it may be ready to feature more prominently in our activities. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some perspectives on Baha'i discourse. I will do this in two, or actually three sections. One, I'll start off giving a kind of simple introduction to Baha'i perspective on discourse. And then I will look at some of the more difficult questions. And then the most interesting part is where everybody discusses it after I stop talking. So I'm looking forward to that. When society is in such difficulty and distress, wrote the Universal House of Justice, which is the world body heading the Baha'i faith last year, our responsibility is to make a constructive contribution to human affairs. How can we make such a constructive contribution? According to this body, community building, social action, and involvement in the discourses of society are at the forefront of ways to make a constructive contribution. An important part of this contribution is engaging in discourses newly prevalent in society, and the House points out that the world stands in need of clear voices that can articulate the spiritual principles that are needed for successful transformation in society. Well, what is discourse? Merriam-Webster, which is now online, of course, defines discourse as verbal interchange of ideas, especially conversation, and as a formal and orderly and usually extended expression of thought on a subject. Lexica, which is the old-fashioned Oxford English dictionary, which we used to go down to the library to find. Oh, now it charges. It defines discourse as written or spoken communication or debate, and as formal discussion of a topic in speech and writing. And Google gives synonyms for discourse. And I think there's a group of synonyms that capture its meaning: discussion, conversation, talk, dialogue, communication, conferencing, debate, consultation. Where do we do discourse? According to the Universal House of Justice, participation in discourse can occur at all levels of society, from the local to the international, through various types of interactions, from informal discussions on internet forums and attendance at seminars, which is what we're doing now, to the dissemination of statements in contact with government officials. There are bodies in the Baha'i community, the Baha'i international community, for example, who engage with leaders of the world and at the United Nations. Where do we do discourse? What is important, according to the House, is to be present in the many social spaces which thinking and policies evolve on issues, on governance, on environment, and climate change, the equality of men and women, human rights, are a couple of those areas where we need to be present, so that the Baha'is can offer generously, unconditionally, and with utmost humility their teachings and their experience in applying them as a contribution to the betterment of society. Very, very important is that the Baha'is adopt a posture of learning. Baha'is strive to adopt a posture, Baha'is and their friends strive to adopt a posture of learning and engage in genuine conversations. And this is very interesting what they say next. As such, they do not set out to offer any specific solutions to the problems that face humanity, such as climate change, women's health, food production, and poverty alleviation. Isn't this counterintuitive? At whatever levels that discourse occurs, the object is not to persuade others to accept a Baha'i position on this or that subject, nor is the effort an exercise in public relations or an academic exercise. I have a friend here actually in Sunnyvale, not Mountain View. When he came across these statements, it's like a big load was taken off his shoulders. I don't have to constantly just promote the Baha'i teachings about various things. The goal is to have meaningful conversations. So wherever Baha'is and their friends work, leaders of all ages and backgrounds are making contributions to discourse. And every believer has an opportunity. I don't know if this is saying it's just an opportunity, but an opportunity to examine the forces operating in society and to introduce relevant aspects of the teachings within the discourses prevalent in whatever social space he or she is present. Now, is this telling us that not only do we have the opportunity, but we should? Sometimes I want to think so. Perhaps the most important part of discourse is learning in action. And the House of Justice, in a letter for the Association of Baha'i Studies, written in 2013, says, the Friends should participate in an ongoing process of action, reflection, study, and consultation in order to address obstacles and share successes, re-examine and revise strategies and methods, and systemize and improve efforts over time. My good buddy, Robert Saraceno, who's a part of this discussion, is a theoretical physicist. I like to tease him, say that I'm an experimental physicist, unless you engage in experiment in action and then examine the actions, you don't learn anything. He usually doesn't have much to say except to agree with me when I say this. So this is an important aspect of Baha'i discourse, engaging in action and learning from action. This action is especially productive when combined with something we've been calling an evolving conceptual framework that organizes thought and gives shape to activities. So, having gone through this kind of basic introduction to discourse, there's some questions, a number of questions that come up. How is discourse different than lecturing, publishing papers, attending and hosting seminars, and other professional and academic activities? That's one important question. What are some of the central themes of spiritual development that might feature in Baha'i engagement and discourse? Where is discourse done, and how do you identify where it's done? How do you create new spaces for discourse? What is the role of an evolving framework? And then for discourse on the environment, what are some important themes? So this is the second part of the talk. Let me launch into some of these questions. How is discourse different? Baha'i discourse is informed by conventional discourse in many ways, but it is different. At its core, it's about transformation inwardly and outwardly, both inwardly and outwardly. Baha'u'llah in the Kitabi Khan writes, and this is, I think, true of every revelation, is not the object of every revelation to effect a transformation in the whole character of mankind. A transformation that shall manifest itself both outwardly and inwardly, that shall affect both its inner life and external conditions. Baha'i discourse is also about framing principles, consultation, and reflection. Baha'is contribute by framing this discussion in terms of principle, seeking out points of agreement, laying the foundation for consensus, directing negative or dispiriting conversation towards constructive and creative paths, and demonstrating those attitudes and behaviors that characterize what the Baha'is have been learning from consultation. Of particular relevance here, and I'm reading from a selection by Shahryar Razavi, who's a member of the Universal House of Justice. Of particular relevance, he says, is the capacity for engaging in conversations on meaningful, oftentimes complex topics. The habits of study and deep reflection assist participants in those conversations in developing their ability to express their understanding of profound concepts. What are some of the central themes of spiritual development? Of course, we would expect fundamental elements of the Baha'i faith to be central. For example, Baha'i teachings teach about the true nature of the human beings, the existence of God, his purpose for humanity, progressive nature of history. But perhaps it is the oneness of humanity, the cornerstone, Shahryar Razavi says, that is one of maybe the most important principle. It has far-reaching implications for a profound change in society, in all aspects of society. Involvement in public discourse clearly cannot ignore it, the paramount value and importance of universal participation in the advancement of society is but one of its implications. How much I wish we could expand on that. There's a lot there. Reaching out to those whose views differ deeply from ours, and to be willing to acknowledge some dimensions of truth in their worldview is very important as well, according to Razavi. Where is discourse done, and how do we identify where it's done? It's done in a wide variety of settings. Universal House of Justice directs us to think about those discourses which have significant bearing on the well-being of humanity. And they talk about engaging in conversations with a wide range of spaces, working shoulder to shoulder with like-minded organizations and individuals, seeking where possible to stimulate consultative processes and draw out underlying principles around which agreement and mutual understanding can be built. So far, it seems like Baha'i discourse is almost a discourse about processes. It's almost a meta discourse. I mean, this is what keeps coming through to me. We're talking about how people can talk together, talk to each other in constructive ways, in a kind of method that eventually involves everybody on the planet. It can even be done with family and friends. Simply through interacting with family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues, Baha'is are frequently drawn into conversation on the issues of the day. Where is it done? Individual contributions have very wide latitude. For those individuals who have achieved a certain standing in their profession or within an academic discipline, their contributions to discourse might be very sophisticated and as elaborate as any produced under the auspices of the institutions of the world. Indeed, such contributions can represent decades of careful study and thought, and may be the result of large amounts of personal effort or the collaboration of groups of individuals. Baha'i-inspired organizations make contributions. Individual Baha'is working together in such organizations are an important contributor to discourse. How do you create a new space for discourse? This is very interesting, especially if we want to create some new spaces for discourse. It's something that Kayla, others of us have been thinking about maybe doing locally, maybe larger than locally. How do you create a new space for discourse? The first step in exploring a new area for discourse, according to Hale Arbab, Hale Arbab has researched these processes of creating discourse for, I don't know, very, very long time, out of Haifa, Israel. And she has a lot of really innovative and instructive ways of thinking about discourse. Exploring a new area, we form as thoroughly as possible a picture of the state of knowledge in the area of inquiry. The material that we would use would be studies conducted by others, their observations, their thoughts, and their conclusions. And this is going to sound a lot like literature review. But she says, this is more than a literature review in a university course. Then I think she really hits the nail on the head. The question before us is this: if a group of people with training in relevant fields examine the body of observations made about some kind of phenomena or activity, scrutinizes the analyses already offered, sorts through the conclusions, then at the same time explores the Baha'i writings for ideas that shed light on the issues at hand, will their understanding of the phenomena be greater than prevalent understanding? Will they bring any new insights into the area of inquiry? So this is a kind of criterion for looking at possible discourses and deciding whether they can be fruitful or not. There are pitfalls as well in discourse, of course. The giving solutions mindset falls short, according to Hale Arbab. It seems important that the group engaged in an area of inquiry avoid the simplistic problem solution mentality. She states this as, humanity has such and such a problem. Our task is to look in the Baha'i writings and come up with a solution. This kind of mindset is not the most appropriate for inquiry into the pressing issues we are facing. I think that's kind of an English form of wit or something like this. Then she says, there are, of course, many principles and concepts in the Baha'i teachings that can be brought to bear on any of the problems of humanity. Then she warns, these principles have to be applied, and fruitful application necessary involves a long process in which many different actors must cooperate. Identifying those principles that govern in such a learning process, for example, is only one among the many challenges that have to be met. In other words, I would summarize this as saying, discourse is not easy, it's work, you have to be systematic, you have to think carefully, and it takes a while. What is the role of an evolving framework? We've talked about that a little bit. So it's a theme that comes up a lot in discussion of Baha'i discourse. An important part of Baha'i discourse, and what unites it with community building, social action, other activities which Baha'is around the world are doing, is a shared and evolving conceptual framework. Universal House of Justice, in its letter to the ABS, says, central effort to advance the work of expansion, consolidation, social action, and the involvement in the discourses of society, these three areas which Baha'is around the world are engaging in, is the notion of an evolving conceptual framework. And they call it a matrix that organizes thought and gives shape to activities, which becomes more elaborate as experience accumulates. Elements of the framework, of this evolving framework, can be characterized as follows. There are core elements, such as foundational premises, principles, concepts, and approaches. There are individual and collective understanding of those elements, which change and deepen over time. These elements might include, for example, foundational premises about human nature, social reality, and the role of history, spiritual principles, so on and so forth. Consultation. Our framework also includes secondary evolving elements of discourse. For example, what are the logistical requirements for engaging in discourse? These are generated through experience suited to a particular stage of our work and susceptible to change over time. For discourses on the environment, what are some important themes? I don't dare tell you what the important themes of the environment are. You should tell me. But anyway, I've got some nice quotes. A recommendation to the Baha'is and their friends. This is from the Universal House of Justice in 2017. Here's what they say. One of the most pressing problems of humanity in the current century is how a growing, rapidly developing, and not yet united global population can, in a just manner, live in harmony with the planet and its finite resources. They elaborate. Certain biological realities present themselves when an organism negatively affects or exceeds the capacity of its ecosystem. The limited availability and inequitable distribution of resources profoundly impacts social relations within and between nations in many ways, even to the point of precipitating upheaval and war. The revelation of Baha'u'llah directly and indirectly touches on a range of such concerns. It's essential, therefore, that Baha'is contribute to thought and action regarding such matters. In telling us to engage in the 2021 Faith Climate Action Week, the United States National Spiritual Assembly suggested the following. They say, while it's unlikely that the institutions of the faith will make decisions regarding the application of technical solutions to climate change, they will no doubt contribute over time to the discourse on spiritual responses to its cause and its remediation. In this regard, the significance of the framework for action that the Baha'i communities have developed cannot be understated. Friends may This is the Universal House of, it's not the Universal House of Justice, the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is in the United States. Friends may consider taking the Wilmette Institute course on climate change, which starts on April 8th and goes through June 2nd, or hosting an event to coincide with Fake Climate Action Week. Let me bring to the fore my conclusions after this short introduction to discourse. Baha'i discourse, I conclude, is a refinement of traditional discourse methods with some uniquely Baha'i aspects, which offer a way to bring into play some of the healing central themes of the Baha'i teachings. Core to the Baha'i view of discourse is the view that we need spiritual advancement and unity if we are to resolve the world's outstanding problems. This kind of suggests that lacking that spiritual advancement and the unity, we're not going to solve the world's outstanding problems. Baha'i discourse can be done anywhere and by anybody. But professional and academic discourse is often best served by those who understand its ways. Engaging in new areas, in discourse in new areas, can benefit from a kind of expanded topic review that considers what can be contributed by bringing into play a Baha'i perspective. And I think it's very, very important for some of us to actually go through this kind of stuff as an extended exercise and to start to see what it means. I have a feeling that approaching things this way is very, very powerful. And that leads to what in Silicon Valley they call scaling. You do it a little bit, all of a sudden you can do it a lot. Important component of discourse is a shared evolving framework that brings coherence with social and community development and actively incorporates new learnings. And then finally, to me, discourse on the environment by the IEF and their friends is an important model of how it can be done or how it is done and should be shared more widely. And let me end with that. I'm just going to suggest that if you want to participate in discourse with some of us, contact us at iefworld.org. Also, in terms of some of the questions that we were discussing, so that they can be used to trigger additional discussions, here's those questions. And with that, I want to end and turn it over to Kayla.
So Stephen is going to be presenting or doing workshops on discourse during the upcoming Association for Baha'i Studies conference. And him and I are going to arrange some sort of forum class workshop this summer for anyone who wants to go further with discourse. And he has put together training materials for getting ready to do it, and then we want to jump in there. So yeah, give us a holler at that email address. I put it in the chat as well if you'd like to be invited to those events. And now I'd like to open this up for discussions, and as food for thought for the discussions, Stephen's putting up these questions for thought. So feel free to jump in, either in the chat or by turning on your microphone. Tell us what you think. We have a question submitted in the chat that says, what are some examples of the fruits of discourse around environmental issues?
I think this is a question for the community present here, right?
Arthur, go for it.
So what was the question again? Can you read that again?
One of our participants is asking, what are examples of the fruits of discourse around environmental issues? What is to be gained? Arthur.
Well, I think that, and we can see this not only in what IF tries to do itself, but in things that is related with like the courses of an institute. So many people who get involved in these subjects begin to change their lifestyles. They try to live more sustainably. They question their attraction by the consumer society and so on. And younger people may actually even pick a whole career. I mean, I remember I was talking about this subject at a Baha'i summer school. There was a high school student there who decided, I'm going to go into the environment. So she got a degree in environment, went on, got a PhD in political science on multi-level governance. She's now an associate professor at Bahá University and a member of the IF governing board, Sylvia Carlson Bencusen. So you plant a little seed and you never know how it will germinate and where it will lead. So I think that's just one example. I also wanted to ask a question of Stephen and maybe Robert and others here, because when we look at these new areas where discourse is needed, perhaps, I think that one of the ones that seems most critical at the moment is all the issues coming with the rapidly evolving technologies. And it's both, the communications technologies and the internet and how people are manipulated by it, or, addictions created by it, or political, issues are distorted, or people are trapped in bubbles of thinking on the one hand, but there's also, I've just been looking, I was on a dialogue 3 or 4 days ago about artificial intelligence and how more and more, computers, are doing things that people used to do. And, this may, eliminate whole areas of employment. But then of course, from a high perspective, everybody has a right to be employed. So it seems to me that, with emerging technologies, there's raising a whole series of whole new ways of looking at society and what technology may be doing to it that require relating that to spiritual principles and the basic human purpose. So I was just wondering, those of you who are working in the areas of physics and so on and so forth, do you see some of the potential areas or some principles that might help us to explore these issues as we go ahead?
Let me try an answer to that first and then ask Robert to talk about it. I think immersed as I am in Silicon Valley, Mountain View claims to be the home of Silicon Valley, and many of the transistor development was done right here. These days, a couple of things show up locally on the charts, so to speak. The incredible success of the Silicon Valley companies has escalated the price of housing and living here to such a degree that it has forced a lot of people into the streets and living in RV vehicles and so on and so forth and so on. In other words, the very success of these technologies is having a major impact on living in California and other leading places like Seattle, Los Angeles, making it very, very difficult for some people and very, very easy for others. There is a emerging Baha'i discourse. I don't know if it's actually gotten to the stage of discourse on these kind of topics. Matt Weinberg has written some absolutely wonderful papers on the topic. There are discussions on the impact of technology on the world, but so far they haven't been incorporated, to my knowledge, in Baha'i discourse. There are lots of bits and pieces around how you, an open question is how do you find enough people who can work on it? For example, Palo Alto and Mountain View and Sunnyvale and these San Jose and these other areas have lots of young Baha'is, capable young Baha'is, degrees in computer science, technology, working for Google, Apple, Facebook. We have a huge skill set of people working here with skills in these kind of areas. How do you go from the kind of environment where people are working 50, 60, 70 hours a week, don't have time for discussion, to where we are starting to engage in a thoughtful and interesting discussion of these kind of things? That's a problem we haven't resolved yet, but it's the kind of problem that's very crucial. Another important problem is the role of racism, systematic racism, in such things as artificial intelligence. We back in the old days, we had an expression, we'd say, garbage in, garbage out. It works for artificial intelligence too. Ruha Benjamin, who's a professor at Yale and a Baha'i, is one of the leading voices in talking about this. So we can talk about both these issues, the technology and systematic racism, both discourses at the forefront of where we're going in the United States now. We can talk about those things. But again, I don't know of any systematic discourse development. I would suggest that where we are is at the cusp of where we can start to take off and engage in these kind of discourses. Discourse has been around, I suggest, for a very, very long time, but in nation form, and that's now taking visible form, and maybe some of these kind of issues will be addressed. Robert, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Well, there are several comments I have about this, with regard to the question. One thing I think that's really important is the realization that scientists and technologists who know a lot about this have no advantage when it comes to discourse about what should be done about the problems that arise from it. So an ordinary person can very rapidly, very, very quickly learn enough about the technology to be able to engage in discourse in as profound a manner that, as we're talking about a discourse regarding the social issues, they can very rapidly learn enough, very quickly learn enough to engage in social discourse with as much profound insights, or as many profound, in as profound a way as a technologist or a scientist. So that's one thing. Secondly, this is increasing the wealth of society. And so the problem is one of distribution. That is, we're locked into a system in which distribution is really skewed, horribly skewed. Abdu'l-Bahá, it's a pilgrim's notes, but one that sounds like close to being genuine in many ways. Many years ago, Abdu'l-Bahá said that he said the problem is that the inventions are owned by what he called the industrialists. That was the term he used. Eventually, the inventions will be owned by the people. And when the inventions are owned by the people, then everyone will benefit from the fruits of inventions and developments. And that result will be there will be a democratization. But it's going to be a while before we end up with it. In other words, this is not inherently a global problem. I mean, it's not a problem if we're united globally. So one of the things that we're trying to do is create neighborhoods. And once the core activities get established in a neighborhood, once a neighborhood reaches the point where it's in a cluster, which is at the second milestone or the third milestone, once a neighborhood really gets established with core activities, then the neighborhood has the ability to address these problems in terms of bringing wealth, generating wealth within the neighborhood, bringing wealth into the neighborhood, generating wealth. They have that ability, and once they reach a certain stage. So at the moment, I think one of the pressing issues is to do what we can to continue with the core activities and to develop neighborhoods which learn how to address the social problems Unemployment's one of them, or it's perhaps one of the major ones. So those are some of my thoughts on this at the moment. That we're at the stage now where we can really begin to rebuild neighborhoods. We have the ability, or we can stimulate the rebuilding of neighborhoods. We have the ability to generate discussion on that neighborhood level, which will help neighborhoods which might be impoverished or might be hard hit to begin to generate their own wealth, to consider things that they can do.
Lance, did you want to chime in?
Sure. So I've had a question that I've been mulling over for a while. It feels like a conundrum. I'm not sure if it is. Maybe it's just my own ability not to see my way through it. But it relates to this idea that we should be approaching our participation in discourse from the point of view of with an attitude of learning, and we're not looking to arrive with prepackaged solutions that we're trying to sell. And I agree with that. I fully understand the power of that. I mean, I'm sure I don't fully understand the power of that, but I'm sure that I have a sense of how important that is. But here's my conundrum is, when you're dealing with a particular issue that you're engaged in discourse on, if it's dealing with situations where people are subjected to gross injustices, or you've got environmental problems that are of the utmost urgency and importance for the survival of our civilization, and you've got ideas, and meanwhile some of the people who also would be participating in discourse, either they don't care about the injustices, or they're people who are actually actively engaged in perpetuating them, or in brushing aside and undermining and downplaying the importance of these existential environmental issues. How do I conceptualize my participation in discourse in those kinds of situations without falling into a completely adversarial kind of mode? So that's, I mean, I think somewhere in there, those two things don't need to be a conundrum, but to me, they still feel like they are.
That's a hugely good question. And maybe Christine can help us. The Universal House of Justice has kind of replied to some people who are bringing up topics in a similar sort or related sort. How, given the social injustice that we see all around us, given the understandable anguish that it generates, how do we respond? And I think there's two answers for that. I think social development is a way that we can reach out to try to work with friends, neighbors, community associations, and other kinds of organizations who are like-minded to address some of those kind of concerns. But my reading, and maybe Christine can elaborate on this. My reading is that there are central principles, and often they are involved with central scientific findings that are crucial to the long-range evolution of principles that can change the world. In other words, there are short-term activities which will not solve the problem. There are long-range activities, the spiritualization of the world, this empowerment of mankind's, of the people of the world, that that may take a little bit longer, that will take longer to address these kind of problems, but are absolutely essential if we are to address those problems. One of those things that is important is recognizing, as the Baha'i community does, the relevance of correct scientific information. Christine, can you talk about that a little bit?
I'm not a good talker, but I can talk. I think it depends. What you said, I think, is really important to have the long-term view. And there are issues, we cannot compromise on our principles. Sometimes the matter at hand can not be answered with yes and no, but sometimes it's very clear from a Baha'i perspective what would be the right thing and what would be the wrong thing. Like the two examples of injustice is that you mentioned, that they are very obvious, where as Baha'is we can have a pretty clear view on what would be the right course of action. So we don't need to compromise on principles just because someone else has a different opinion. However, I think often it is not possible in such situations to change someone else's mind, nor is it our task to change anyone else's mind. But we can, as a service to public discourse, offer our view with spiritual principles and seek unity in other ways with the person by acknowledging their humanity, where they are coming from, and respecting their person, and try to put effort, like with that same person, in another way, in another situation, or with other people. There is so much to be done. So it's an organic, slow growth. It's a change of culture. It's not we cannot, I think public discourse cannot achieve instant solutions for anything, but it can contribute to a long-term cultural change. I would have some contribution to the previous topic, but I talked too long. So if at the end, if there is more time, we can come back to the previous topic.
So I see. Oh, go ahead, Kayla. I see Arthur, then Mark, and then Christine again.
Just with respect to this issue, I've just been preparing children's classes on Abdul Baha's visit to America and how he dealt with racism. Now, of course, in 1912, segregation was deeply entrenched in America, and yet, the example that he set was one by looking very positively at all the advantages that came from looking at racism. Just one example, because I had it right in front of me. The husband of the house where he was staying in Washington, Agnes Parsons' house, the husband said he wished that all the blacks would return to Africa. To which Abdul Baha replied that such an exit would have to begin with Wilbur, their trusted butler. It's just how he turned things in some positive way. He didn't make it a controversy. Of course, at the same time, he asked Agnes Parsons to organize a race unity event in Washington, which she eventually did, even though this was totally against her social standing and everything else. He encouraged Louis Gregory to marry a white woman, which again at that time was totally unthinkable and illegal in many states. So they had difficulty in traveling in the South because they weren't allowed to be together. But he never took it on politically, but he was extremely courageous in showing the positive side of things, the positive ways forward. And I think with all these issues, we need to say, how do we turn this in some positive sense? Without yielding on principle, but trying to create movements forward and pushing people, questioning people's assumptions in some way that's not aggressive, and helping them to grow and evolve.
Mark.
Hi, we're talking about Baha'i discourse, and part of that is how do we do that? Is it in the written form? Is it spoken? Is it in a meeting room, on the phone? And it's the Baha'i approach discourse, and one of the components of that is how we talk to each other. And when Lance was asking his question about how do we do this without contention, I had handy with me a quote, a Baha'i quote about consultation or discourse in person. And it's not a picture of the stereotypical contesting dialogue or debate that you hear where everyone's fighting for the floor and no one's really listening to each other. Let me just do a quick part of this quote. Man should weigh his opinions with the utmost serenity, calmness, and composure. Before expressing his own views, he should carefully consider the views already advanced by others. If he finds that a previously expressed opinion is more true and worthy, he should accept it immediately and not willfully hold on to an opinion of his own. It goes on, but that's the general idea.
Thanks for sharing that, Mark. Robert.
Can't
Okay.
hear you.
So yeah, I'm unmuted now. So you see, we engage. I love this presentation here, Stephen. I thought it was just fantastic, and what you brought together, you know, is really, really good, succinct and yet comprehensive both. So in discourse, we engage people in discourse on the level of solving problems, and whoever it is we engage in discourse. If the person has no problems, there's no point in engaging in a discourse. In other words, I don't engage in discourse with somebody who, oh, everything's just fine. There's no problems here. There's no discourse to engage in on this level. We engage in discourse with people who want to solve problems that they themselves are involved in, and so you work with those people. Now, now I lived in South Africa for many years. And we lived in South Africa during the transition from white rule to universal suffrage, and Baha'is themselves were very involved. The majority of Baha'is were, of course, people of color, and the Baha'is themselves were very, very involved with the communities of color. And they were not involved excessively in white discourse, but a lot of white people engaged in discourse, and I was aware of what they were talking about. And so they had serious problems. The problem is that they knew the country was becoming ungovernable. They knew that it was unstable. That is, the tremendous wealth and privilege the white people had, 15% of the population, compared with the other 85% who were disadvantaged. They knew it was unstable. And many of the white people, although as I say, I didn't engage them in discourse because as Baha'is were involved with other things, but they would talk, you know, and you know your neighbors, you know people, and they would say basically, we have to give up power. We have to give up power in such a way as not to result in the kind of reaction that you saw in the French Revolution, you know, kill all the aristocrats. And we have to give up power in such a way there will not be a violent reaction, which will violent attack against white people. And so they came to that conclusion. So if we Baha'is are involved with discourse, suppose we're involved with discourse with very wealthy people, they have serious problems. They know that their wealth is unstable, that their situation is unstable. They kind of sense that. If they don't sense it, well, there's no discourse to be had with them. If we're engaged in discourse with with people who are at the bottom of the economic ladder. Their problem really isn't how you grab what you want. Their problem is how do they survive? And so we're engaging in discourse with people who have their own problems, and it has to be such that they come up with solutions to their particular problems. So I don't see the antagonism or the antagonistic aspect as being something that we need to be concerned with, because of the solution to the problem with poor people is not to march on the rich people and grab it because they know they can't do it. If you talk to somebody who's homeless, what's the solution to his problems? Well, somehow to get a home, through legitimate means. So those are some of my thoughts on this.
Barbara. We might come back to Barbara. Gary.
Okay, I found the unmute
All
button.
right.
Okay, I have several thoughts. Number one, because I live in Appalachia, in Tennessee, and like nobody discusses these issues with me here. And I visit quite a few different Baha'i communities because I'm isolated. Anyway, I think we have a PR problem, number one. Number one, what you need is some younger people. I love you all, and your thoughts are so deep and great and whatever else. But frankly, we've all been told lately that if you're trying to communicate with a young person, you got to get on a tweet or iChat or something, that this face-to-face discourse is not the primary method of communication with the younger generation. And as much as I might disagree with that, it's a reality, and I think we should consider that. I think we need to be getting a message out more often. I did break down and learn how to text message and learn how to go on Facebook. And I'm thinking, well, that's as far as my communication goes, but it's okay. I live in an area where people are so conservative and so undereducated, not underintelligent, but undereducated and underexposed. I mean, there are people living around me who have never been off this mountain. You understand? And so they have to be exposed to new ideas, and you can't walk up to them and to say, hey, look, this is what you should be doing. I live in the midst of this on purpose because of what I am doing, trying to get as much non-polluting energy going on my property, trying to get, I'm trying to do agroforestry. We have plenty of trees here, but I'm getting native trees that are productive and showing other people that they can do this easily and cheaply, because the state of Tennessee will sell you trees at a bargain bottom price, but you have to be a Tennessee resident. Sorry, you can't, the rest of you can't access that anyway. So that's the number one thing is we have to have communications. Like, on Facebook periodically somebody puts a Baha'i quote out there that's kind of pertinent to the times, and I share it, and I'm thinking that's one thing, is just to have somebody or anybody or all of you putting things out there in the media that shares a quick, easy idea. You don't have to sell them on the whole idea of net zero carbons emissions right now, because that's beyond the comprehension of most people around me. And I know that, I understand that. So if I can get them to understand that glass bottles are actually a healthier way for you to store your food than in plastic, that kind of resonates with them. They're thinking about what's healthy. And that's, I would have to say that's a common topic these days. What is healthy? So what is healthy is also good for the environment. So that's an avenue to start a communication without telling people about net zero or whatever else might be in your heart. If you can just find an avenue of something that they are interested in and keep giving them messages from Baha'i quotes and from things that you know and read and understand that will connect. It don't feel like you have to sell the whole ball of wax at one time, just little bits at a time, and people change. So it's communicating to the young people, getting little ideas that resonate. And I'm saying, it would be really good if you had a contact center. I mean, I realize that in a way you do, but if Christine hadn't told me about this, I would have never known about you. Okay, I think you have a major PR problem, is that most of the Baha'is don't know that this group exists. There is one Baha'i in my area that got very concerned about Mr. Moore's book about, I can't remember what it was, something about the energy issues. And she was worrying because people were telling her that electric cars were a problem, because obviously most of our electricity is produced by coal. And that's true. If you're going to get a electric car, you should also get some solar panels to generate the electricity for it. And then you're actually doing something. But most of the people around me are totally oblivious to all of that. So those are little ideas that just need to keep being pushed out there. And then if somebody says, oh, I'm thinking about getting an electric car, how do I do this? If they have somebody they can call or at least email, contact, and get some expert information on things, that's really great, because as we know, the world is full of false information right now. So you need a source where people can get trusted information. So those are my suggestions. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. You brought up multiple ideas. One is marketing for this IEF organization. And if anyone has any ideas of what we could do or has marketing skills they want to volunteer, please email us at ief@ief.world. This also brings up, I'm going to read Lena's comment from the chat on taking individual action, which is another point that Barbara brought up. Lena says, I believe a critical conversation we should all be talking about is how to walk gently in this world and how to leave the smallest environmental footprint as possible. Mm-hmm. People always look to institutions or governments, but individuals can make profound differences. Recycling, not driving a lot, buying less, not eating meat. Baha'u'llah tells us to change our diets towards not eating the flesh of anything else. And yes, meat is a huge impact on the environment. Barbara also brought up the topic of engaging young people in their first language, so to speak. And another message, Bill and Sherry put on the chat, can you successfully have discourse on social media? I would love to hear from anyone. Right next up here, I'm going to call on Gary. But after Gary, if anyone has ideas about how to successfully have dialogue and discourse on social media, or has done it successfully, feel free to chime in and give us some good ideas. All right, you want to go, Gary?
I'll give it a try. Can everybody hear me? This was what I'm going to try to say relates to what most everybody has said one way or another. It was triggered by the conversation between Stephen and Robert back towards the beginning. But as I talk, I'll try to make it tie in, and I hope it's not too rambling. What was occurring to me, we're talking about having a discourse, how this is a long-term process, and it ideally involves a humble posture of learning, and that we aren't going to go to the table with solutions, which are all great. The thing that occurs to me, and it doesn't occur. I mean, many people are saying this, but the developed world, particularly the elite elements in the developed world, and including certain of those elements that are in the less developed world, are just galloping away with technological development that has a long lifetime. When these things start, they tend to set a path that the rest of society follows along on. And this process that is dominating social and civilizational development is tending to preclude discourse, preclude the participation of the multitude of peoples in the world. And that's partly what Barbara, I think, was getting at. So the question becomes, is we're engaged, we're all individually engaged in a variety of individual discourses that cluster around these issues that we're talking about. But it seems unrealistic to think that the betterment of humankind is really going to be something that is worked towards until this whole process is brought to a halt. This galloping process of development that the elites of the world are generating, which I think a lot of us are included in that that term elites. We're engaged in these conversations. Some of us more so professionally than others, but is that process to really be fruitful? And this to me gets to the core of the teaching, saying this is a long-term process. We aren't coming to the table with specific solutions. We're dealing with underlying spiritual principle and cultural issues. And how does that concept tie into our various individual and concerted efforts at engaging in public discourse, social action, and our efforts to work towards the betterment of humankind? Thank you.
Christine, do you want to respond?
Arthur wants to respond.
I'm just thinking, responding partly to Gary, but also, when Stephen was talking about the situation in Silicon Valley, and it occurred to me that you were, in a sense, in your domain where the United Environment Forum was 25 years ago, where there were a few of us working in this area, and we needed to build more capacity in the Baha'i community to take part in meaningful discourse. So 20 of us organized a little association, and it's gradually grown to what it is today. And it seemed to me that, and where many of us were professionally involved individually, coming together gave us another way of looking at things and stimulated cross discussion. And it seemed to me that you might have potential in this area of, what do Baha'i principles have to say about the information technologies and all behind it? Maybe there's a need to organize among yourselves and stimulate each other with some questioning and thinking about some, and I think this is an issue. I was actually invited to go to the Baha'i World Center a few years ago because they said they have ISGP for students, saying, how do I apply Baha'i principles in my academic, studies? But they said afterwards, there's no accompaniment. And so they said they wanted to look at the International Environment Forum and EBBF about the business in the future as two professions that had organized within the profession to accompany themselves, each other in applying Baha'i principles in the professional area. So it seems to me there may be an opportunity now in this other area to begin to network and to try to build some momentum and encourage each other to form another professional association of those of you who are really into these technologies and asking questions about them to take this area of discourse further.
Robert.
Okay, well, this is, I hope I'm not talking at a tangent. I hope I'm addressing the actual issue on this. But so we engage in discourse with people who want to engage in discourse, okay, or who are ready to engage in discourse. And so, as always in the faith, we have a double task. Like when the faith was very, very small, the task was finding people who would want to hear about the Baha'i faith and then telling them about it. It was a dual task. And so the fundamentally this is a spiritual process. That is finding people, preparing people, engaging in discourse. It's a spiritual process. So the spiritual process involves purifying your own life and involves lots of prayers and lots of meditation. So our task is to find people who want to engage in discourse and then engaging them in discourse. So the people who rule the world, like Baha'u'llah says, beware, O people of Baha'i, lest those who rule the world fill you with fear. And so those who rule the world, among them, we have to find people. If we're talking about, okay, so discourse is at the local level, national level, international level. So we're talking now about the international level. Among the people who are running the affairs of the world, we have to find among them people who want to engage in discourse, who see problems with what they're doing, problems with what's going on. And that's a spiritual process. We find people like that through various means, having webinars like this, talking to government officials, whatever means we do, engaging academics who are very prominent. So we find people, and then once we found them, we engage in discourse. So those who we have not yet found, those who aren't interested, we leave them to themselves, confident that God is in charge. Baha'u'llah has the fate of mankind in his hands, and they will be dealt with in their own way. So, yeah, I hope that is not at a tangent to the issue that was being raised.
Lena had her hand up for a moment.
Yes, I took it down. Just because I knew I was next. So can I, Arthur, Dr. Dahl, I wanted to elaborate further on what you said. And in conjunction with this whole, what could create more discourse, there is virtually no literature out there available that compiles Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, the Universal House of Justice statements on science and technology at all. So we cannot just go to somebody and say, this is what we believe, or this is a good compilation. You could kind of start to investigate through this. It doesn't exist. It is just amazing how in the writings there is so much on health and nutrition, on medicine, on nature, on the universe. Oh my God. I mean, we thought Islam did a lot with regard to, bringing advancement to astronomy and such. They did develop algebra 200 years before Isaac Newton even discovered it. What has been revealed within the Baha'i faith on just astronomy alone and astrophysics is phenomenal. There is no compilation out there, and you have to go and physically go through so many different forms of the books. So anyway, that would be one of my first calls, is that we really need these compilations. It's an enormous task, but it really needs to be done. And from that, people could really, come up with more discourse and more dialogue in general regarding the environment. So that's what I wanted to share. If I'm sorry.
It's a good job for an association. With IEF, one of the first things they did was develop a compilation, in the writings on the various environmental themes, put it on the web so everybody could access it. So jump in and do it.
Yes, and Dr. Dahl, I did review it, and it's what you've attempted to, what you've started is very important, but it is not thorough at all. There is just, it's just amazing how much there is out there. So, I just wish that, if that alone could be a theme of the IEF, there would be, a huge service right there to humanity, a huge service, because the writings are filled with it. And the more I dive into the writings, the more I'm just exhausted. And I mean, we need help. This is not something an individual can do. An individual can tap in a little bit, but believe me, they're going to be missing at least 70% of what's out there, even if they do their best. So this is something that maybe the IEF could consider, is to compile more write-ups on different subjects: climate change, individual responsibilities, the diets and what that might look like, and environmental, what we're supposed to be growing and eating. There's so much out there on medicine alone, my God. So I was told, so you guys, if there's any Persians here, maybe you can confirm, because I don't know, I don't speak Persian, but I was told that there is a untranslated tablets by Baha'u'llah in the archives in Haifa that is just on health and nutrition, and on what we need to do environmentally to really foster health and nutrition. If this is true, we need to really pressure, them to translate this, to get this translated, if this is true. So I don't know anything else other than, what I was told. I don't know the names of the tablets. I know nothing. But if it is true that these things are just sitting and untranslated, in the basements of Haifa, we need to get going on that.
Christine.
There's a tablet to a physician that is now has been available in English for quite a long time. Maybe that's what you were referring to, because in the past it was not available, but it is now available. I think on BahaiLibrary.org, you can try that out. I'm actually impressed about the huge compilations on the website of the International Environment Forum. Some of them, especially on nature and human relationship with nature, seems to be extremely comprehensive. However, I think you're right on technology. There is not much, but that was my point. I wanted to come back to that topic, is technology, because I'm right now in a study group, and we study Ruhi book 13 on social action. And as you know, the three areas of action: public discourse, social action, and community building, these are overlapping efforts. And there is, especially in book 13.2, there is very strong paragraphs about the wise use of technology, and even the concern of local people losing their work because of technology is raised there. So this is now in, like, it has come to the attention, I think, of the Baha'i world. We are just starting to learn about this book, but this raises these questions. And the whole purpose, I think, is to encourage us to, in all the actions, be it social action or public discourse, that we come at it as, that we approach it with an attitude of humility and consultation, and with knowledge, both from the scientific technological field, by consulting experts, but also with applying spiritual principles, and that people really need to be empowered to make these decisions after a consultation and considering all these aspects, so that it's always the well-being of the community that is in the forefront, and not the profit of some corporation that wants to sell a certain technology or so.
Stephen.
So I loved what Lena said. I do want to invite her to, we have this yearly course on science, religion, and technology. Unfortunately, we lost Christine's unit because she went off and started this really successful course on the environment and so on and so forth. But we do have a unit on technology. Robert Saraceno is one of the course teachers. So every year we're having this course with the Wilmette Institute. It's started to become quite popular, almost as popular as Christine's course, which is very popular. And last year we engaged in an experiment. We started to have lots of discussions online. We discovered that three Zoom discussions a week online seemed to somehow be the right thing to do. Like I say, we do have a unit on technology. We also have a unit on discourse, and we're adding a unit on the social sciences. It's kind of, there's a lot of stuff in it. I strongly encourage you, Lena, to join us. We'd love you. There is a excellent book. I forget the first author, but John Hatcher is one of the authors, which kind of catalogs all the Baha'i writings on science and religion. If you make sure I have your email address, I can send that to you. I agree with you about the we need a resource list for writings on science and religion. Maybe we could add an addenda to the IEF one. That would be kind of cool, and maybe even start to develop one on technology. I agree 100% about the need for those kind of materials. We do need people who are willing to work on those kind of things, because to a certain extent, it's easy to become overextended. For example, Robert Saraceno and I are working on an article on the cosmological writings in from Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, and so on and so forth. And we're trying to correlate them with those in the modern physics, astronomy, and those kind of things. But oh my gosh, it's hard work. Also, so we need people we need resource people who want to start to contribute to these kind of things. And maybe our discussion today will trigger some of those kind of activities in the future. Maybe I mean, we're going to try. Kayla and I have been talking about doing some discourse discussion in the Bay Area soon, and there, people are talking about these whole issues about, especially about racism, technology, the impact, the social impact upon the division between the rich and the poor, the high prices, the housing, and what's more, there are politicians. There are lots of good politicians around here. We have the benefit of nonpartisan government people. So there's lots of people who are willing to engage in discussions of these kind of things. And there's a whole cultural infrastructure of people who are fascinated about these kind of things. So the opportunities are there. Yeah, and I think this idea of accompaniment is maybe something kind of a missing piece of the puzzle, so to speak. Just saying too many things.
I believe Mark wanted to say something.
Stephen and Christine have already done it to a degree. I was going to mention the resources on the IEF website, which Christine mentioned. Also, I wanted to put in a plug for this series. And I'm preparing a paper on social science and physical science perspectives on water, adding the ecology, society, social coherence. It's not just technical, but it's also an input to other research topics, because water by itself seldom occurs. It's usually water and something else. I think out of all the UN institutions, none of them are dedicated just to water, but there are something like 26 that deal with water. UNICEF, for example, does water and representing children and women. That's just one example. But anyway, I'm putting in a plug. That hasn't been scheduled yet, but it's been talked about today.
Thanks, Mark. We're coming up here. We've passed our hour-and-a-half mark. It's been our longest webinar so far. Great discourse on our topic, everyone. I wanted to read a few comments that came up in the comment section. John says, a missing but necessary component associated with social discourse is the creation and testing of the resultant models from the discourse. I'm thinking that this is where we must be prepared to enter and become a part of the modeling, implementation, and assessment process. Without this involvement, it would be up to those who hear, based on their own personal experiences, to create models without other inputs. And this comment is exactly in line with our mode of learning and the scientific method that the Baha'i faith tries to follow with regard to learning, consultation, correction, and repeat. We've also got a comment here from Bill and Sherry say, is it possible to initiate discourse by acting on short-term problems? Absolutely. Long-term problems are just a series of short-term problems, right? Easier to deal with smaller chunks. Make progress. And I'm going to formally close the meeting, and we're going to stay open for further comments and discussions. Thank you for joining us, everyone.